Great. Okay. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks for taking the time. Thanks, everyone, for joining. We're still getting this a little bit perfected, so please excuse some of the hiccups on my side at the beginning. I'm Paul Siegel. This is a Meet the Gurus event. I think some of you who've attended before, you know it's all about getting to meet the gurus. In this case, Rachel Chung, who's an experienced data scientist and business professor and got lots of hands-on, practical, real-world experience. And I'm just the talking head that tries to kick this off and have some interesting discussion for about a half an hour or so. And today's topic is all about attitudes. So before we get into attitudes, mine, Rachel's, and kind of some of yours, I thought maybe we should just kick it off with a discussion about, Rachel, how you got into the world you're in terms of data science and instructing and being a professor, and what some of your passions are, in addition to the interesting drinks you have on the back of your blackboard there.
Well, we have a lot to celebrate today, so definitely want to have a virtual cocktail with everyone. Thanks for having me here, Paul. It's good to see you and have everybody here. So thank you for the opportunity to share my story. So my experience, I think, is probably interesting to a lot of you, especially in terms of career change. I've changed my career several times and definitely had to change my attitude several times during my career trajectory. I started as a psychology major undergrad. So being a data scientist and being a data science professor teaching machine learning in a business school was definitely not part of my high school plan. I specifically chose to not major in business at all. I did everything I could to avoid majoring in business. I had no idea that one day I would become a business school professor. But there you go, story, sort of lesson learned number one, never say never, because you never know. And be open-minded. I never thought that I would get into AI. Well, here I am. I never thought that psychology had anything to do with computer science. Well, I was proven wrong over and over again.
Right.
I worked, my first job out of PhD program was working in a face lab. So it is called face lab. It's not called an AI lab, but that was before we had Facebook. We had all these computers in the lab where we train computers to recognize heads first, and then you have to recognize faces, and then you have to recognize where the eyes are, and then you have to label the wrinkles around the eyes and pretty much every wrinkle on the face so that you can actually recognize if a person is smiling or not. So the face lab was all about recognizing facial emotions, and I was working with a bunch of psychologists. It was actually a depression and anxiety lab. We had no idea that this will become in a Facebook app, basically recognizing if we're happy.
Exactly.
So a bunch of those people who work in the lab work at Facebook now in Pittsburgh, and we just had no idea we were there to be a psychologist, really.
Interesting.
All the work was led by a psychiatrist. And so I think what I wanted to say is that I grew up with very silo thinking. I grew up in Taiwan, actually. And the way the education system was structured was very siloed. It's all about tracking. It's actually a German system. In high school, you have to decide if you're going to be a doctor. You have to be on the medical track. If you want to be an engineer, you have to be on the science track. And, and so high school, you already go on different tracks. And so I was trained very early on that you have to pick something, you stick with it, and you can never change. So if I got into psychology, I'll stick with psychology. I never thought I could change my major or change in my career until I came to the U.S. and everybody was changing their major.
Right.
I became a professor, and my students were changing majors every semester. I was like, oh my gosh, I did not know that I could do that. But, I started to learn that, the face lab was also, I don't think any of the people who work in that lab knew that one day we will have face recognition AI.
Right, exactly.
Because at that time, we didn't know that AI could work, or AI will live beyond the domain of computer science. But if you think about it, what artificial intelligence is really using computers to simulate how people behave, because intelligence comes from people. So it's basically simulating all the things, mundane things that we do daily. So all that work actually lived in the Department of Psychology. So I was at University of Pittsburgh at the time. And if you think about AlphaGo and all the AI that learns how to play chess and Go chess, we had a huge lab at University of Pittsburgh where they studied how humans play chess. So if nobody studied how humans play chess, how can you teach the computer how to play chess, right? So all that AI work actually came from the study of cognitive science, and also a lot of brilliant people who actually was able to cross the silos and say, guess what? Outside of the computer science department, we have something valuable to learn in the psychology department, and let's work on this together. And that's how we started. Basically, it was a collaboration between the Robotics Institute at Carnegie Mellon and University of Pittsburgh Psychology Department, where we started this face emotion recognition work.
Let's go back a little bit, because you've jumped very fast. You're very fast forward. Obviously, your mind works very fast. Let's go back a little bit to, in the education biz, or in the education world, people refer to competencies. They refer to them in kind of three buckets: knowledge, skills, and behaviors, or attitudes. Attitudes, obviously, that we're going to talk about today. So knowledge, skills, and behaviors are those things that drive capability in some area. So let's first, if you can, before we get to behaviors and attitudes, talk about knowledge and skills. Obviously, because you've come into this data science business and education part of this with a lot of those things. So let's talk about that distinct from attitudes and behaviors. So what are we, when you talk about knowledge, and you sort of measure knowledge among the students you have and the people you teach, how do you measure the knowledge and the skills?
Well, so one of the biggest challenges for any professor is to figure out if your student knows something. Right. And it's very funny, because students are not trying to lie or cheat, but it's actually very easy for them just to give you exactly what they heard from you. Right. And you get this, illusion that they've learned something. And especially in coding, okay, so I would say coding is a skill, it's also a knowledge. But I think that a big distinction between the skill and knowledge is that you can actually do something that would be a skill, and you can reproduce something correctly without actually understanding how it works. Okay, so I would say that, you can have the skill of coding without the knowledge of computer science. And I see that a lot in my students, and sometimes in myself as well. When I started to learn how to code, you can copy and paste, and you can reproduce people's code, and you can read a book and get it to work. However, if you don't understand what you're doing, then if I change the question a little bit, then you're not able to, so the key is to see if you can actually solve a new problem. So as a professor, we constantly have to just change the question a little bit and give a new problem, a slightly new problem. It has to be a little different, but not too different, as a test to see if the students remembered anything and whether they can actually produce something independently.
So some of the knowledge comes from sort of the broad awareness of a field, but also the tools and techniques that one applies in that field. So,
Right, and also a lot of the theory, right? So the theory of why we do these things and the principles behind how everything works. Right. The mechanisms, right? Under the underlying mechanism, not just the surface stuff, right? So, but really, truly, why does this work?
Right. So instead of just being that kind of trained chimpanzee, we often use the example of trained chimpanzee who knows how to copy and paste the code because it'll work in this place. You have an understanding of why and therefore why not also when you apply something and when you don't, right?
Right.
So in my case,
exactly.
In my side, the working with instructors and people obviously like yourself, including yourself, we often measure things like, I have sort of two measures, and I've mentioned this to others before, is that we look for instructors who are world-class experts, passionate about teaching, really know the subject from a what I call pracademic point of view, practical practical application, but academic rigor. So that's one bucket. And the other the bucket I put it into is what I call the sweetheart bucket. So is the person knowledgeable, have those competencies, and also have a great attitude? Because the world's I shouldn't say best, the world's most knowledgeable, so-called capable person who has a lousy attitude is a misery for me as a professional to work with. And it's probably true in everyone's career. I mean, you probably run across people in your own travels, in your own career progress, where they were just geniuses. They were super capable, but they really couldn't work with others, right? That attitude problem.
Right. And attitude is related to the motivation of the person who's learning from you. And teaching is a big knowledge transfer problem, right? So it's not just how much I know. I have to get what I know in my head to you. And how do I get my, sort of my mind, my knowledge to you? Is not just about how much I know. It's actually about how much you're able to receive it from me and integrate it into you, and that it has to be actually pleasant enough for you to spend a chunk of time with me and willing to actually absorb that, open-minded enough to absorb that information from me.
It's an interesting combination of things. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So it has only very little to do with how much I know. It has a lot to do with, honestly, how much you like me, right? Because if you don't like me as a person, it's game over. No matter how knowledgeable I am, you're not going to be able to learn very much from me.
So, and also, not only it's as you just said, but it's also that your knowledge and skills, when they're transferred to me, I not only have to like you, I sort of, in some ways, adopt your attitude, right? I adopt your passion, I adopt your perspective. I can tell you this many stories about my own, which I won't, but about how I've learned from someone, and I think, wow, that is a great way of looking at a problem, and it also helps me learn better. So if I have an attitude that's in alignment with my teacher, whether it's in an academic setting or a pracademic setting, a practical setting, either way, hopefully they're both, I now have a perspective on how to solve a problem.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think you were describing an attitude of perhaps curiosity.
Yeah.
Right? And so if I'm passionate and I'm excited and I'm curious about the topic I'm teaching, no matter how boring it is,
right.
If I can excite you and I can show you that there's actually something great to be discovered here, then I think you're more likely to learn, even if it's a subject that you used to find boring.
It's quite fascinating. I mean, I went to school, the University of Pennsylvania, and I went through what is kind of like was a march for knowledge, let's say. And it started out with, mathematics and economics, and a lot of my friends were in economics, so that's what I did. And we had a great department there, et cetera, et cetera. But what was interesting, the last semester, I took a course on the history and sociology of science. Now, I had no idea what that was, but it sounded fascinating. It was called Invention and Discovery in the Arts and Science. And the man who taught it was a brilliant man. Unfortunately, he's passed away. Friend of Einstein, literally. I know that because he had photographs of him in his office. And one thing I don't think people are provided early enough in their career is that freedom to learn beyond what. So I was sort of pursuing knowledge and skills, let's call it, but I didn't have a perspective on this whole other area that fascinated me. My niece actually went and studied the history and sociology of science at one of the best schools in the country, not the world. And it was great for her as a doctor. I mean, you could have gone into psychology, it's sort of, so I think that one of the things that I feel is lacking often, and I think in education, but you pointed it out, is having, the providing people a perspective on different attitudes you can have, different interests you can have because of your attitudes, behaviors. And I think it's a very undersung. I don't know how to articulate it well. Probably you can articulate it better than I. But it's this idea that we have to get, as you said, you had the very, I guess, a very regimented early education when you had to go through this, and then you suddenly said, "Wow, that's not all there is." So I think that one of the parts that I hope we as an organization, but as people can do also, is provide sort of alternative attitudes for people to really see that a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a sociologist, a politician, whatever, some politics, can move into a totally different field, not constrained by what they thought they were supposed to do. And that, it's like when parents, some parents have said things like, what are you going to do if you want to be a poet? You'll never become anything as a poet. Well, there are lots of people who have those types of backgrounds who are working at high-tech companies today. So
exactly.
It's quite...
Yeah, I would say that one of the most important attitudes I had to learn was to move away from silo thinking to connective thinking, right? So I used to think that, like what you said, doctors probably don't need to study history, right? And that's how the education systems was set up, that when I chose the medical track, so we didn't have to study geography, or history, any of the soft like social studies, humanities. We didn't have to study that anymore. We had to stop maybe 10th grade so we can focus on science and biology. So I was brought up on this really silo thinking, right? That doing that is going to take time away from your science and math. Right. So to become a good doctor, you need to focus on that. Whereas, if you want to major in business, then you have to study all these things and not these other things. Like biology is not going to help you with your business major. Right. And I always, I now have discovered that that's just not how the world operates. Think about I always told my accounting students, well, why are we making you take a chemistry class? Well, guess what? You're probably going to become an accountant for ExxonMobil, or, if you work for Deloitte, they're probably going to send you to all sorts of factories and all sorts of industries and sectors. Manufacturing, right? Pharmaceutical, and you need to be able to at least have a conversation with people in that industry, right? People are going to talk about all these chemicals. You need to have a basic conversation with people. So this, if you are a business major, even if you're an accountant is such a specialized, skilled professional, they do not operate in silos in this world, right? They have to interact with other industry. I mean, accounting lives in all sorts of industries. So, a well-rounded, well-educated person education is going to make you a better accountant. It is definitely much more beyond your income statement and debits and credits.
So can you choose your attitude? I mean, a lot of people like myself, and I think sometimes I've been a prime offender of this, I can become very emotional about something and very attached to my idea, right? Or my perspective. So can you choose your attitude? And if so, how do you, some people call rewiring your brain. How do you rewire your thoughts to take that deep breath and have either a different attitude or a different perspective? Do you have some techniques that people can use to actually do that in their work?
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm not an expert on attitude change, but I have recently been paying attention to some of the behavioral change research, right? And trying to actually retrain myself on small things, like, for example, portion control, doing more exercise, and just improving my health and life in general. It's hard. But I do find that trying to do something that makes me happy, associating something that I usually don't like doing, I'm not a very athletic person, so I don't really like to exercise very much. But if I associate it with something I usually like to do, and I do something that makes me happy after I exercise, then eventually I can actually train myself. So it's almost like training your puppy. And I learned a lot from teaching machine learning. If you think about how you train a machine learning is really about training your computer to learn something.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually training a computer is in some way is very similar to training your puppy, and which in some way is very similar to training your baby. If you have a small child, you're trying to potty train your child. It's not very different from potty training the puppy, which is actually something that you have to do to train yourself if you want to change your behavior or change your attitude.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I do find my attitude changing over time. Over a long time, I used to get very, very emotional about being rejected, for example. Mm-hmm. In the academia, life is all about rejection. Mm-hmm. We get rejected all the time. People tell you your paper is bad. Your paper is rejected. Mm-hmm. This is not good. I mean, all they do is you're not good enough. Mm-hmm. Well, that's what we call feedback. Because how are you going to learn if your professor doesn't give you feedback? Right? How do you learn to write a better paper or do a better research study if nobody's telling you how to improve? Well, mm-hmm. that's a positive way to think about it. Mm-hmm. But the reality is when you look at those words, right? Rachel, you're not doing this right. You should have done this. I can't believe you didn't do this. Your sample size is too small. It all sounds like criticism. Mm-hmm. So it took me a long time to learn how to really turn those things into something positive, right? I have to change my own attitude. And I find it very useful to actually write gratitude letters. Right. I don't have to send them, but I actually have to say, thank you so much for this feedback. Thank you for telling me this, right? Thank you. No matter how harsh these things are, even rejection letters have to say thank you. Even if it's just a letter that only I see, mm-hmm. I have to find a way to be grateful for those things before I can overcome my frustration and depression about rejections.
Right. I mean, you're not going to...
Once I overcome those things, you do have a new appreciation, a new perspective for rejections, and you do learn from them, and you actually become a better person, right? So at the end of the day, I'm the person who's benefiting from all this rejection.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Now, the interesting thing is one is not going to ever be able to change you can't rely on changing someone else's version of criticism, right? You're not going to be able to say to them, could you be nicer you might be able to say it, but it might not be effective. Someone is going to communicate the way they're going to communicate. But how you take it, as you just pointed out, can be quite different.
It's in your own control.
It's in your own mm-hmm. control. So, you can become furious, or you can decide, that's an interesting input. Let me sort of strip away the person's tone of voice. Let me strip away everything else. And let me listen, try to get through that noise, find out what were mm-hmm. they saying. Now, they may say, mm-hmm. I'm too short, or I'm too tall, or I'm too fat, or I'm too thin, or whatever they were saying. Obviously, I'm just using metaphors. But, or is that a simile or an analogy? But, we need to strip that away and get to what was the point. Because, mm-hmm. you might be very close to doing what you, getting it right, for better or worse. You might have been very close to being able to put your algorithm into the right, process. But you might have been a little bit off, and that noise that was the stupidest, that was the stupidest insight you've ever had. And then you could say, well, could you be clearer? And then they start detailing, and then it wasn't that stupid. It was maybe a little bit off. I used to use the analogy. I met a banker years ago. It was a very senior guy at a very big bank. And he said to me, sometimes you're in the dark and you're banging your head against the wall, and suddenly someone turns the light on and you realize you were standing 1 foot to the right of the door. So you are sometimes very close, and the harsh criticism is just clouding your perspective. But I think that, what sort of this choosing your attitude is often about trying to pick out from what someone's communicated to you or the environment you're in the best things to be as productive and as effective as you can. It would seem to me.
And having a positive attitude towards them, right? And looking for something positive, even in the most negative criticism, is something that you can choose to do.
Right. You don't have to rely on the noise. You can cut through it and find out, what can I benefit from this? What did they tell me? And now that may not be the person you want to turn to in the future for advice, because you had to do a lot of digging to cut away to get to the point. And that may not be the most helpful person in your life, but you can't let it drag you down. And I think you can't let you drag you down even in an interview. You talk about getting rejected in paper submissions, and whether it's a promotion or this, that, and the other thing. There's people who go through interviews all the time and get cut down and feel miserable. But in fact, we won't go through all the phenomenal number of stories of people who were failed out of college, or who, told them, I used to have a book, I think it was called The Definitive Authoritative Dictionary or Encyclopedia of Misinformation. It was I used to keep it by my my bedside, and it was every night I'd read a few more of these humorous things, like the Beatles, their sound is on the way out, or the comment about, computers, there'll only be 2 or 3 needed in the world. I mean, all these profound insights that are not profound at all, obviously, but people say them with such authority that many others who have ideas that are brilliant walk away dejected, whereas in fact they just should have taken that insight, if you will, for what it was, another person's point of view.
Exactly.
And sometimes I would imagine the best way to look at a job interview for a lot of people who are listening to this is that often they're giving you an opportunity to realize that maybe you shouldn't be working for that company. Maybe they're not the right fit for you. Maybe they don't understand you and you couldn't understand them, and that's a good thing. Maybe your dream job at Amazon or at Facebook or Microsoft or Zillow or whomever is not your dream job. Maybe your dream job is becoming an entrepreneur or an academic or a writer or whatever. There's so many roles for us to play, and I don't want to sound too whiffy about this, but the truth is, I was just watching the inauguration with this young, beautiful woman who was the young Nobel laureate, and you think about how she was 16 when I think she became the youngest, and now she's all of 23. She has these most brilliant words that Maya Angelou could have been speaking, and you thought, holy cow. There is brilliance among us, and there's brilliance, I think, in every person. And I'm not a feel-good kind of person. I'm not trying to make people feel good. But the reality is there's brilliance in everyone. And part of the academic and educational experience is to help you realize that and to feel confident about your own, capabilities.
Yes. I think those are very profound thoughts, and the book that you mentioned sounds very interesting. I think everybody should read that.
Yeah.
To know that nobody really knows anything. I mean, people will make these predictions. I always say that even my machine learning predictions are only so good, right? 60% of the time.
Right.
Nobody has, perfect vision 2020, and so you got to believe in, if you feel strongly about something, go for it. If you strongly feel that something is a bad fit, you're probably right. Because you know yourself, you should know yourself better than anybody else.
Yep. There's a very profound, I thought fairly profound, it's a fun movie that I've watched many times called Ronin. It's with Robert De Niro and several other major actors. And one of the scenes is they're asking Robert De Niro, how did he know something was going to happen? And he quotes a line that he was taught. He said, whenever there's a doubt, there is no doubt. So whenever in your gut, you know that there's something off, or maybe I'm not getting this, then you need to address that, right? You need to respond to it, as opposed to, pretending that it doesn't happen. You didn't feel that way and pretending. So your perspective and our senses are a lot more sensitive, I guess, than many of us are aware at many times.
Right. So in communication, these days, people always say, well, you got to learn how to listen to other people. Well, I think listening is a very important skill. But a lot of people don't even know how to listen to themselves, right? So I think listening to your own emotions, listening to your gut, right? getting really in tune with what's going on in your life, right? And if you have that gut feeling, never ignore it. Right. You know, if you ignore yourself, who is going to pay attention to you?
There's also, I mean, in every hiring situation, I can tell you, because I've hired many, many people in the past, and my experience has always been, I always look for people with great attitudes. Because I think if you have a great attitude and you're hungry to learn, then there's pretty much no stopping you. If you're the smartest person, as I said, on the planet, but you have a lousy attitude, the chances of succeeding are pretty small. I mean, you may be, because of your brain power, just so impressive, but there are lots of great examples we can use today where people are the smartest in their class, the best in their class academically or whatever the metric is, and at the same time, no one will work with them. They're miseries. And I think about being effective in your career and in your life is in part very much about your attitude. And I think that, you know, it's an unsung thing. And we as a education company focusing on a lot of technical skills, a lot of business skills, you know, don't want to shortchange, you know, helping people develop the right attitudes and the right perspectives, I think.
Yeah, well, I think that's a very, very unique advantage of Starweaver because I think that's just being a technical training company. I think I'm really impressed to see how much you emphasize attitude and interpersonal skills because nobody works alone. You can only achieve greatness if you can get other people to work with you.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the time today. We'll do this again, and thank you for everything you do and your involvement with us going forward.
Thank you so much for having me, Paul. This is great.
Okay. Take care.